Let's talk about consciousness for a minute. There are a number of different theories out there in regards to how it's formed. And in my personal experience, none of them are really accurate. And that's not just my opinion. Most scientists agree that consciousness is a question that we really don't understand yet. You take the work of Antonio Damasio, for instance. In the book The Self Comes to Mind, he describes the formation of consciousness with somewhat ambiguous terms, and he's a very scientific author if you've ever read his work. And if you have not, I highly recommend you start with Descartes' Error. In this book, he identifies that consciousness begins to form at different levels, and that we could take a cell as a form of proto-consciousness. And the way he describes it is in terms of physical process, that consciousness is a state of interaction with the environment, being that the first form of consciousness was about cellular interactions, mainly responding to heat. And then as we obtained different levels of consciousness, we saw different things manifest, which this view is interesting to think about, but it doesn't really answer the question. Then you take the work of, for example, of Karl Pribram. I haven't read a ton of his stuff, I will admit, but a lot of what I do in neuroscience is based off of his work. Primarily the idea that you have chaotic systems that are self-organizing that lead to self-organized behavior in a complex environment. These dynamical systems are fascinating to observe, and some of our most sophisticated algorithms we use in, for instance, targeting for our advanced weapon systems on our flying predators, F-22s, things like that, use this type of algorithm where you're looking at a dynamic environment that's ever changing, and then you're looking for how this chaos will come together and coalesce into meaning. And that's how these algorithms work to search and destroy. You can use those same algorithms to understand the human brain in terms of electromagnetic frequencies that the brain produces. We find that an anatomical definition of the brain is useful to an extent. The amygdala, the hippocampus, the corpus callosum, the prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC, and on and on and on and on. But the reality of the matter is when you look at the brain, it seems to be that there's this high level of interconnectivity. And even if you destroy certain areas, on occasion, they can be bypassed through neuroplasticity. And this leads people scratching their heads a lot of times. They're like, is it anatomy? Is it connectivity? Is it complexity? So that's a very different approach. And then you take the idea that consciousness it developed and existed in an intersubjective environment where you have people coming together, and the reason consciousness exists is because there's multiple brains. There'd be no point in consciousness if there was a single brain. So thus consciousness is an evolution as a result of social structure. And then you take the idea of Thomas Metzinger in the ego tunnel, probably my favorite definition of consciousness. He looks at it in a philosophical standpoint that it's this total internal reflection where you have a recursive algorithm that's reflecting upon itself. And that process of reflection is illusory, meaning that consciousness itself is epiphenomenal, which may in fact be the case, but we really don't know. And then you have other people that argue quantum standpoint. But quantum is pretty loose when it comes to a definition of consciousness because you can explain a lot of the things that people see and identify as quantum fluctuations in a much better light. For instance, we know from the work of the individual that wrote The Singularity is Near, he wrote another book called The Making of a Mind. And in that book, he talks about the idea that when you look at brain formation, you look at DNA, the DNA is insufficient to form an entire brain. But when you look at anatomical structuring of individual singulates or small regions of the brain, you find that they form these things called Makarov chains, which Makarov chains are a mathematical type system that activates based off of a probability reaction. And in the instance of the brain and neuronal firing, the aqueous environment surrounding a neuron acts as that fluctuation point, mainly the temperature of that environment, which I find rather ironic when you consider the fact that REM or rapid eye movement and other sleep processes, one of the key motivations and important aspects of sleep is regulation of the brain cavity's temperature. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. Ultimately, like I was saying, a lot of this becomes rather confusing because we really don't have a good definition of consciousness. And I would argue that consciousness comes down to physical process simply because that's the tools that I can concretely measure. and without getting speculatory and having you invest in my own intersubjective concepts, what I would say is that consciousness exists based off of physical principles, mainly complexity of the interaction. There has to be a sufficient level of complexity, meaning X number of neurons firing simultaneously. And then number two, there has to be a timing basis for those neurons. And it could be a differential, meaning one neuron could fire at 0.2 seconds, another neuron could fire at 0.204 seconds, so on and so forth. And then finally, you have to have this level of complexity. You have to have a sufficient number of them working in unison at the same time, which is rather ironic when you think about the fact that the number of computations the brain can run in one given instance of its life is 10 to the 80th power. And that's based off of an average of the number of neuronal connections that can take place with the different neurons inside your brain. 10 to the 80th, that's a very large number. Just some little thoughts on consciousness and to get you thinking. The coolest things that you should really know about consciousness, though, is we used to think that the brain was plastic, or excuse me, that the brain was not plastic, that it never changed. But now we know that's not true. Even up into your 70s, we know the brain is in fact plastic. We've seen data proving that it changes and alters itself. And on top of that, taking it a step further, we know that certain regions of the brain, including the hippocampus, which is essentially the key to episodic memory, meaning it acts like the keystone of an access system or a data system that can help information be stored and regulated throughout the brain, but it produces neurons throughout your entire life. The primary thing that inhibits the formation of new neurons, which you should be aware of, is actually stress. So stay less stressed. And if you want to stay less stressed, maintain lots of social connections and get lots of cardio in.